Welcome to the Silent Empires, where every story feels like a quiet conversation carried through the dark. This channel was built for the late-night listeners, the ones who enjoy calm voices, shadowed atmospheres, and stories that unfold slowly, one moment at a time. No ads, no interruptions, just uninterrupted storytelling made to keep you company through the night. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to leave a like. And in the comments, tell me something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? It's always amazing to see people from different parts of the world gathering here together, all sharing the same quiet moment. The camera opens in darkness. A roar rises before we see anything, a crowd screaming inside a mid-century boxing arena, the sound echoing off concrete and steel. Ringside, camera flashes strobe the faces of champions and promoters, gamblers and reporters. In the smoky haze between them is an absence, a space no one dares to name on record, a man who almost never appears in the photographs, yet decides who fights, who wins, and who never fights again. Cut to a very different room, a Senate hearing chamber in Washington, D.C. in the late 1950s. The air is still, microphones lined like bayonets. A small, compact man sits at the witness table, expression blank, eyes unreadable. Senators press him with questions about fixed fights, intimidation, hidden ownership of world champions. Each time, he leans toward the microphone and says only, "I refuse to answer on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate me." He repeats it again and again, as if reciting a litany. Outside the chamber, headlines accuse him of strangling an entire sport from the shadows. Inside the underworld, he is feared as a man who can make a problem go away with a phone call. To understand how one discreet racketeer could come to hold such quiet power over boxing, and why his name would become shorthand for corruption in the ring, you have to go back decades, to the dense, noisy streets of immigrant New York, and a boy who learned early that the law did not protect people like him. At the beginning of the 20th century, New York City is overflowing. Between 1890 and 1920, more than 4 million Italians arrive in the United States. Tens of thousands crowd into the city's tenements. On the narrow blocks of the Lower East Side and East Harlem, laundry stretches from window to window, carts choke the streets, and every hallway seems to hold another family. In August of 1904, one of those crowded apartments becomes the birthplace of Frank Carbo, the child of Italian immigrants trying to piece together a living in a city that barely notices their existence. The records for poor immigrant families in this period are thin. Birth certificates can conflict with baptismal records. Spellings shift with each official's pen. What is clear is that Carbo grows up in precisely the sort of environment that shaped a generation of Italian-American racketeers. A world where the language of home is not the language of the school, where factory jobs pay barely enough to eat, and where children are thrown into adulthood almost as soon as they can walk. The neighborhoods around him are a maze of tenements built fast and cheap. A single room might hold parents, children, a boarder taking up the corner bed. Toilets are shared, heat uncertain, light scarce. Yet the streets outside seethe with activity, pushcart markets, organ grinders shouting newsboys. Boys Carbo's age run errands, sell papers, shine shoes, anything that brings in coins for the household. Respectable work is hard but not impossible to find. The real challenge is that it is often temporary, badly paid, and constantly under threat from prejudice. Anti-Italian hostility is a steady fact of life. Newspapers caricature the new arrivals. Landlords and employers see them as expendable labor. In schools, teachers sometimes Americanize children's names without asking, treating Italian as a backward tongue. For many boys in this environment, the street becomes its own kind of institution. Older youths, some already tied to local gangs, set the rules. They offer an alternative model of success: quick money, sharp clothes, and a kind of power denied to their parents. By the time Carbo is old enough to roam freely, New York's Italian underworld is already in motion. Early Black Hand extortionists, loosely organized criminals who prey on fellow immigrants with threatening letters and demands, have given way to more structured gangs. The Morello family, the seeds of what will become one of New York's mafia organizations, operates in Harlem. Racketeers control gambling, certain labor unions, and protection rackets in their neighborhoods. Violence flares, but usually in shadows and side streets, where it is easier to ignore. In this environment, the line between petty delinquency and organized crime is thin. Boys act as lookouts for card games, deliver packages, or carry messages. A teenager who proves reliable in these small roles may be trusted gradually with more serious tasks. Contemporary police records and later court documents show Carbo attracting official attention very early. By his late teens, he is known to law enforcement as part of the city's pool of young Italian toughs, one of many, but beginning to stand out. It is hard to reconstruct any single formative moment that pushed Carbo firmly toward the underworld. There is no surviving diary, no confession of a crossroads. What we have instead is a trail of indications, arrest records for minor offenses, mentions in police intelligence files, and later testimony by associates. They describe a youth who adapts quickly to the unspoken rules of the street, who understands that silence is valued more than almost anything else. The culture of omerta, the code of not cooperating with authorities, is not a formal creed taught in a classroom, but a lived expectation. Witnesses who talk find their lives upended. Those who keep their mouths shut, even in the face of arrest, earn a certain kind of respect. Meanwhile, the larger forces shaping his world accelerate. In 1917, the United States enters the First World War. The conflict touches immigrant neighborhoods unevenly. Some older youths are drafted or enlist. War industries expand, offering new jobs in factories and shipyards. For a boy like Carbo, on the cusp of adolescence, the war years mean more absence of older men and more room for younger ones to step into informal authority on the blocks. It also means greater suspicion directed at foreign communities, as patriotism heats into nativism. The war ends in 1918, but the turbulence continues. The Spanish influenza pandemic rips through the city, killing thousands. Economic uncertainty follows. And then in 1920, a single federal law transforms the underworld, the Volstead Act, enforcing national prohibition. Overnight. Alcohol, one of the most socially accepted commodities in American life, becomes contraband. For established and aspiring gangsters alike, this is an opportunity on a scale previously unseen. For young Italian-American toughs, as for their Irish and Jewish counterparts, bootlegging is the business of the era. Smuggling liquor, running speakeasies, guarding shipments, and enforcing agreements require an army of drivers, lookouts, guards, and when disputes arise, gunmen. The potential profits draw in men who might otherwise have remained small-time predators or neighborhood guards. They are now part of supply chains that stretch from Canadian distilleries and seacoast landings to lavish nightclubs in Manhattan. Carbo comes of age at this precise moment. By the early 1920s, his name appears repeatedly in police blotters. Arrests for carrying weapons, for robbery, for assault. Some stick, many do not, as witnesses fail to appear or change their stories. The pattern is familiar to detectives of the era. A youth tightly bound to a community that distrusts the police, working for older figures whose names are more carefully kept out of official reach. Later accounts by investigators and journalists describe Carbo as aligning with Italian gangs that would eventually fold into what came to be known as the Lucchese crime family. At this stage, affiliations are still fluid. The city's Italian mobsters are locked in struggles for dominance, particularly between the old line boss Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, and his rivals. To young foot soldiers, what matters less is which banner flies above them and more who pays on time, who offers protection, and which groups seem most likely to prevail. Carbo's skill set suits this rough economy. He is not a charismatic leader, not the sort of figure who controls neighborhoods by force of personality. Instead, he earns a reputation as a dependable soldier, quiet, efficient, unflappable under pressure. Those qualities will later make him invaluable, but in the 1920s, they simply mark him as someone who can be trusted with tasks that more volatile men might fumble. The work is dangerous. Rival gangs compete for territories. Bootlegging routes are contested not only by criminals, but sometimes by corrupt police and political fixers. Deadly confrontations erupt in restaurants, on street corners, in apartments above storefronts. Newspapers report gangland slayings with a mix of alarm and lurid fascination, but the details they provide rarely point to concrete prosecutions. Within this landscape, Carbo's first major intersection with the broader public record comes in the form of a murder charge. In the early 1920s, he is arrested and indicted in connection with a killing in a Manhattan restaurant, an incident the press describes as another explosion of gangster violence. The specifics, as preserved in surviving clippings and legal documents, reveal the common features of such cases. A noisy argument, weapons drawn, a victim left dead, and a community suddenly afflicted with collective amnesia when the grand jury convenes. Witnesses who initially speak to the police recant. Others cannot be found. Evidence turns out to be insufficient. In the end, prosecutors are forced to drop the case. Legally, Carbo walks away innocent. Practically, he walks away with something more valuable in the world he inhabits, a reputation for having beaten a serious rap without betraying anyone. In the calculus of the underworld, that counts. From this point forward, Carbo is not just another street corner tough. He is a man who has stood in the crosshairs of a murder investigation and emerged intact. This raises his status among more established racketeers, who now see him as someone worth cultivating. It also deepens the gulf between him and any possibility of a straight life. Employers who might once have hired a young immigrant with a minor record are unlikely to take on a man whose name has been linked in the newspapers to a killing, even if no conviction followed. The cycle feeds on itself. By the middle of the decade, as prohibition reaches its lush peak, with speakeasies everywhere from Harlem basements to midtown hotels, Carbo is entrenched in the bootleg underworld. Police files of the era list him as an associate of known figures in liquor smuggling and enforcement. Each arrest that doesn't lead to a long sentence reinforces an impression among his peers. He is lucky, yes, but also disciplined. He doesn't talk, he doesn't panic, and he doesn't seek the limelight. At the same time, the broader architecture of organized crime is becoming more structured. The so-called Castellammare War, a bloody power struggle among Italian gangs, erupts near the end of the decade, culminating in the murders of Joe Masseria and his rival Salvatore Maranzano. Out of that turmoil, a more centralized mafia commission emerges, dominated by figures like Charles "Lucky" Luciano. While these high-ranking leaders reorganize the upper tiers of power, men like Carbo operate at the crucial middle level. Not bosses, but essential cogs in the larger machinery of rackets. In this rapidly professionalizing criminal world, internal discipline matters. Orders must be obeyed. Disputes need to be settled efficiently. Violence is used, but selectively, as a tool rather than a thrill. Carbo, with his low profile and cool demeanor, fits well into this culture. But a life built around carrying weapons and settling disputes also means constant exposure to danger, and eventually to serious legal consequence. That moment arrives in 1928. According to later summaries in law enforcement files, Carbo becomes involved in a confrontation that ends fatally. Accounts differ on the precise circumstances, whether it was a quarrel that escalated too far, a dispute tied to bootlegging territory, or something more personal. What is consistent across the record is that a man is killed, and that this time the authorities move aggressively. Carbo is arrested and charged. For once, prosecutors manage to secure a conviction, though not for premeditated murder. He pleads guilty to manslaughter. The plea avoids a full trial, but it also carries a heavy price. He is sentenced to a substantial term in prison, more than a decade on paper. For a man still in his 20s, it is a stark interruption of the trajectory he has been following. He is sent to Sing Sing, the grim prison overlooking the Hudson River north of the city. The institution is notorious, both feared and mythologized, its name a byword for hard time. In those years, Sing Sing holds a mixture of petty thieves, violent offenders, and a significant number of organized crime figures. For someone like Carbo, the experience is punishing but also instructive. Behind the walls, hierarchies reproduce themselves. Men from the same neighborhoods or ethnic backgrounds tend to cluster together. Contacts are made, alliances formed or deepened. For Carbo, who already has underworld connections, incarceration becomes less a break from his chosen world and more a different classroom within it. He has time to observe how older, seasoned gang leaders conduct themselves when stripped of their street entourages. He learns who truly has influence and who merely had the appearance of it. Prison also reinforces the underworld's code of silence. Inmates who are suspected of having cooperated with authorities are shunned or worse. Those who are known to have taken long sentences without giving information gain an almost mythic standing among some peers. Carbo's own status is shaped by this culture. A manslaughter conviction tied to a violent incident, taken without implicating anyone else, reads in that language as proof of loyalty. Outside Sing Sing's walls, the world he left continues to change. Prohibition grinds on into its final years, bringing both enormous profits and increasing federal pressure. Law enforcement slowly improves its methods. Tax evasion becomes a powerful tool against crime bosses. The stock market crash of 1929 throws the broader economy into crisis. Breadlines appear in the same neighborhoods where gangsters drive expensive cars. Carbo serves only a fraction of his original sentence. Good behavior, overcrowding, and the routine functioning of the parole system of the era combined to shorten his stay. After roughly 20 months behind bars, he is released on parole in the early 1930s. On paper, he emerges as a man who has paid his debt on a manslaughter conviction. In reality, he steps out of Sing Sing more deeply enmeshed in the underworld than when he entered. He returns to a city staggering under the early blows of the Great Depression, yet one in which organized crime has never been more entrenched. The visible saloons of the pre-1919 era are gone, replaced by speakeasies and private clubs. Illegal gambling dens thrive, sometimes in back rooms of legitimate establishments. Labor racketeering offers new avenues for control and profit. And hovering around all of it is an entertainment form that, by now, draws both working-class fans and high society patrons into the same smoky halls: professional boxing. For the man who will one day be described by U.S. senators as a shadow ruler of the prize ring, the foundations have been laid. He is no longer a hungry boy dodging truant officers and searching for coins on the sidewalk. He is a hardened operative with a serious conviction behind him, a network of criminal allies, and an instinctive understanding that real power is exercised not under the arena lights, but in the spaces just outside their glare. When Frank Carbo steps out through the gates of Sing Sing in the early 1930s, the river beyond the walls is the same gray ribbon he saw on the way in. Almost everything else has changed. The stock market crash has blown a hole in the American economy. Men line up at soup kitchens. Factories slow or shut down. Respectable work, never easy for children of poor immigrants, has become even more scarce. But in one corner of the economy there is little sign of depression: the rackets. In New York, prohibition is still in force when Carbo comes home. The city's underworld has spent a decade perfecting its systems. Smuggling routes from Canada and the Caribbean run smoothly, protected by payoffs to police and politicians. Illegal breweries hide in warehouse basements, while liquor is poured openly in hundreds of speakeasies that everyone pretends not to see. For ambitious criminals, the great advantage of this situation is simple: demand is guaranteed. People drink in good times and in bad, and now every drink runs through hands like theirs. Carbo slots back into this world as if he had never left. He returns to the Italian neighborhoods where his name is already known, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof of a certain kind of toughness. He has gone upstate on a serious charge, taken a sentence, and come back without nomming anyone else. In the culture of organized crime, that counts for more than any formal resume. Men who might once have treated him as a minor errand runner now look at him with a new, wary respect. The Italian gangs he connects with have themselves been reshaped. The bloody power struggle known as the Castellammer's War, which raged in the late 1920s and early 1930s, has ended with the assassinations of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Out of that conflict, a younger, more modern leadership has emerged. Charles Lucky, Luciano and his allies envision organized crime less as a chain of feudal fiefdoms, more as a set of cooperating businesses. They divide territories, share profits, and create a loose national commission to arbitrate disputes. In this new order, the old Gagliano group, led by Gaetano Gagliano and his right-hand man, Thomas "Tommy" Lucchese, holds sway over a slice of the city that includes much of the Bronx and parts of Manhattan. Over time, that organization will be known publicly as the Lucchese crime family. Within its ranks are men whose names will never be known outside police files, and a few whose reputations will eventually leak into the newspapers. Carbo, not a boss but a reliable soldier, falls squarely into the second category. Law enforcement documents from the era, pieced together decades later by investigators and historians, list him as an associate of the Gagliano, Lucchese faction. He is not a policymaker. He is a man who carries out decisions. In the slang of the time, he is a torpedo, a gunman and enforcer who can be sent to collect debts, intimidate rivals, or settle disputes that cannot be solved with words. His previous manslaughter conviction is a liability in the eyes of the law, but in his world it serves as a credential. By now, prohibition is nearing its end. Political pressure against the dry laws is building. The federal government is losing tax revenue it badly needs in the Depression. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repeals prohibition. For many gangsters who have spent more than a decade building empires on illegal liquor, the change could have been a catastrophe. Instead, the more adaptable among them view it as a transition. The skills they have honed, moving contraband, corrupting officials, enforcing agreements, can be applied to other illegal markets. Gambling offers one such market. Horse racing, numbers games, dice and card games in back rooms, all of them already exist, but the end of bootlegging pushes more manpower and capital into them. Labor racketeering offers another, controlling unions and extorting employers under the threat of strikes or sabotage. Construction, trucking, the garment industry, even bakery deliveries become fields in which the underworld can plan itself. For men like Carbo, who are comfortable operating in the shadows, the shift is less a rupture than a diversification. In this climate, something else takes on new significance: the entertainment industries that continue to draw crowds even in hard times. Nightclubs, theaters, and sports offer escape from the grind of poverty and unemployment. Boxing, already a popular sport, thrives in the Depression. A ticket to a fight at Madison Square Garden or a neighborhood arena offers drama, a sense that any underdog might triumph with enough heart. For the underworld, the sport offers something else: betting opportunities, leverage over promotions, and, if handled carefully, a steady source of influence and profit. Organized crime's involvement in boxing did not begin with Carbo. Well before his rise, local toughs protected fighters, shook down small promoters, and occasionally leaned on referees. Some early champions had silent backers from the neighborhoods where they grew up, but the scale of this involvement is still relatively small and localized. Carbo, observing the sport's economics through the eyes of a man trained in rackets, sees that it can be systematized in a way similar to other businesses. First, though, he must secure his own position. The early 1930s are not simply a time of opportunity. They are also a period of intense law enforcement attention. New York's special prosecutors and district attorneys, eager to make names for themselves, begin targeting high-profile racketeers. Thomas E. Dewey, appointed special prosecutor in 1935, goes after major figures in vice and labor racketeering with an energy and professionalism that surprise many in the underworld. Dutch Schultz is driven out and later killed. Luciano himself is eventually convicted on prostitution-related charges. A man like Carbo, not a kingpin but close enough to the command structure to be visible, feels the pressure. Police intelligence units know his name. He is stopped, questioned, frisked. Arrests for carrying concealed weapons dot his record. Prosecutors often cannot make the charges stick, but the pattern is there. Newspapers occasionally mention him in small items about suspects picked up after gangland slayings, only to be released for lack of evidence. By mid-decade, internal reports compiled by law enforcement agencies list Carbo as a suspect in a series of violent incidents, even when there is nowhere near enough admissible evidence to bring him to trial. Detectives quietly refer to him as the kind of man who is near trouble without ever being caught in the act. An internal memo from a later period, summarizing his record, notes that he has been arrested more than a dozen times but convicted only once in the 1928 manslaughter case. This ratio, to police, infuriating, to his underworld associates, impressive, becomes a defining feature of his reputation. Around this time, a new institution on the Brooklyn waterfront and in the brownstone streets of Brownsville and East New York comes fully into being, an enforcement arm for the intertwined Italian-Jewish rackets that journalists will later dub Murder, Inc. The phrase is sensational, but it captures a reality. Rather than every local boss maintaining his own squad of killers, a centralized pool of gunmen is available to handle serious disciplinary problems. Run primarily by Jewish gang leaders like Louis Lepke, Buchalter, and the Shapiro brothers, and overseen in part by Italian bosses linked to the national syndicate, this group allows high-level figures to keep their own hands cleaner. Later testimony by former insiders and contemporaneous law enforcement summaries place Carbo within this orbit. He is described as one of the men to whom assignments could be directed when a particularly difficult or delicate job needed doing. The details of specific incidents are, unsurprisingly, murky. They rely on the recollections of informants who had incentives to shift blame and on circumstantial evidence. But the overall picture that emerges is consistent. Carbo is regarded by authorities as a professional enforcer whose name comes up repeatedly in connection with homicides, even as indictments remain elusive. It is important, in looking back, not to romanticize this role. The culture around Murder, Inc. has sometimes been dressed up in lurid colors in popular culture, as if it were a darkly glamorous club. In reality, it was a network dedicated to intimidation and elimination. Its existence increased the sense of impunity with which organized crime could operate, knowing that it had at its disposal people prepared to enforce decisions with permanent consequences. Carbo's association with this world, whether as a full participant or a frequent collaborator, deepened the fear his name could inspire among those who crossed the wrong interests. At the same time, his personal habits set him apart from some of the more flamboyant figures of the era. He is not a man of showy nightclubs or big public scenes. Reports from detectives paint a picture of someone who prefers quiet, smoke-filled back rooms to spotlighted tables. He dresses neatly but not extravagantly, speaks little, and cultivates a manner of calm detachment. That low profile serves him well in a line of work where attention can be dangerous. As the decade progresses, the economic logic of organized crime continues to pull him toward more stable rackets. Liquor is now legal again. The big money in that business has shifted above board. But boxing, still only patchily regulated and deeply entwined with gambling, stands out. A fighter's career can be owned in percentages. 10% to a manager, another slice to a trainer, a cut to a promoter. Hidden in those shares can be additional, undisclosed interests, pieces quietly held by underworld figures who put up money for training expenses, travel, and early purses. Carbo begins appearing, according to later testimony and investigative reporting, in the circles around small-time managers and promoters. He is not yet the power in boxing he will become, but he is already testing the waters. In dingy gyms where young men pound heavy bags under flickering lights, in cramped promoters' offices upstairs from pool halls, a pattern repeats. A hard-looking man with a reputation is said to be with a promising fighter. That can mean a lot of things. Sometimes it is as simple as providing loans in exchange for a future share of earnings. Sometimes it carries an implicit understanding that certain contracts cannot be broken without consequence. It is in these years that Carbo first crosses paths with figures who will later become his close partners in the boxing world. One of them is James "Blinky" Palermo, a Philadelphia racketeer with a similar interest in the sport. Palermo, connected to organized crime in his own city, develops a parallel network of hidden interests in fighters and promotions. Together, over time, the two men will come to hold significant, if unofficial, stakes in the careers of multiple boxers. But in the 1930s, these relationships are still embryonic, more a matter of shared ventures than an organized empire. Sport itself provides cover. Boxing remains a rough, often unregulated business. Many fighters come from poor backgrounds, with little education and limited options. Contracts are opaque, purses may be shaved before they reach a boxer's hands, and managers sometimes treat fighters as expendable assets. In such an environment, the involvement of figures like Carbo can be rationalized by some as merely part of the landscape. They bring money, they get results, they can take care of problems. The costs of their involvement, the coercion, the threats, the narrowing of fighters' choices, are real but often unspoken, buried under the day-to-day hustle. As the 1930s draw to a close, storm clouds gather that will affect every aspect of American life. War breaks out in Europe in 1939. The United States is not yet formally involved, but its economy begins to shift toward defense production. The underworld, too, adapts. Some rackets, like certain forms of smuggling, become more difficult under stricter port controls. Others, such as black market dealing in rationed goods, will flourish once the U.S. enters the war. For Carbo personally, the end of the decade brings another kind of pressure: the gradual unraveling of Murder, Inc., and the growing willingness of some insiders to cooperate with authorities. In 1940, Abraham "Abe" Relez, a key hitman within the organization, turned state's evidence. His detailed testimony implicates a range of enforcers and bosses in dozens of killings. Trials follow. Some of the most feared gunmen of the era are convicted and eventually executed. The myth of an untouchable enforcement arm begins to crumble. In Relez's accounts and those of other informants, Carbo's name surfaces in connection with killings carried out in the 1930s. Prosecutors, eager to bring cases against as many alleged members of Murder, Inc. as possible, look hard at these claims. Grand juries are convened. Indictments are prepared. For the first time since his 1928 conviction, Carbo faces the possibility of being tried not just for carrying a weapon or for lesser charges, but for homicide in connection with organized crime's most notorious enforcement apparatus. The results of these efforts will shape the next phase of his life. They will also underscore a pattern that has run through his entire career: the gap between what law enforcement believes about his actions and what it can prove in court. While some of his contemporaries on the enforcement side of organized crime are condemned to death row, Carbo will again find a way to slip through the legal net. That narrow escape, coming just as he is tightening his grip on pieces of the boxing world, will further cement his reputation as a man who operates effectively in the space between rumor and conviction, feared by many, known intimately by few, and almost never held to account in a courtroom. By 1940, The back alleys and corner saloons of Brooklyn that had once sheltered 100 small-time hoodlums were under a kind of siege. The city's newspapers buzzed with a new phrase: a murder syndicate, a crime factory, an organized pool of killers available on call. Behind those headlines was the relentless work of Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer and his investigators, who were peeling back the layers of a secret system the press would soon call Murder, Inc. For years, unsolved killings with a familiar flavor, victims shot in doorways, found in cars, left in empty lots, had accumulated. Now, for the first time, prosecutors had a reliable insider willing to explain them. Abraham "Abe" Relez, a stocky, sharp-faced gunman from Brownsville, had been arrested in 1939 for a Brooklyn killing. Facing the electric chair, he did what his world considered unthinkable. He began to talk. In chillingly matter-of-fact detail, he described a network of professional killers working for the city's intertwined Italian and Jewish rackets, taking orders from high-ranking bosses to eliminate informants, rivals, and defiant associates. Names poured out: Louis Lepke, Buchalter, Mendy Weiss, Harry Pittsburgh, Phil Strauss. And among those names in the notes and summaries that investigators compiled appeared another: Frank Carbo. To O'Dwyer's staff, and to the detectives who had spent years watching funerals follow gangland shootings, the mention of Carbo came as no surprise. For a decade, his name had appeared again and again in intelligence files whenever a certain type of killing took place. Efficient, unemotional, offering little in the way of clues. They had rarely been able to make those suspicions stick in court, but now, through Relez and other cooperating witnesses, they hoped they finally had something solid. The specifics of the cases in which Carbo was allegedly involved varied. In some, the testimony was secondhand. So-and-so said that Frankie had taken care of a problem. A driver recalled dropping him near a scene on the night someone was killed. In others, the claims were more direct. One informer swore that Carbo had personally participated in a killing ordered by higher-ups in the syndicate as a warning to potential defectors. Whatever the exact truth behind each allegation, the cumulative effect was enough for prosecutors to move. In 1940 and 1941, a series of indictments swept up many of the men named by Relez and his fellow turncoats. Carbo was among those arrested and charged in at least one murder case tied to the Murder, Inc. investigations. The stakes could not have been higher. Other defendants in the same web of cases eventually received death sentences. The state made clear it was prepared to seek the maximum penalty against those it considered contract killers for the underworld. For the second time in his life, Carbo found himself facing the possibility of decades behind bars, or worse. His previous manslaughter conviction had sent him to Sing Sing. This time, if convicted of murder in the first degree, he could expect no such leniency. The press, sensing a story, highlighted his record. Articles reminded readers of his early conviction, his repeated brushes with the law, and his reputed role as a Lukey's family gunman. His photograph, usually a mugshot, began to accompany these stories. A compact man in his 30s with a broad, relatively expressionless face and dark, flat eyes. Then, in November 1941, the most important witness against Murder, Inc. fell literally out of the story. Abe Relez, kept under heavy police guard at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island to protect him until the trials were complete, was found dead on the pavement 6 stories below his guarded room. Officially, the explanation offered was attempted escape. Relez, panicked at the prospect of eventual retaliation, had tried to climb out the window using bedsheets and fallen. To many observers, including some within law enforcement, the story strained belief. The tabloids coined a bitter joke: the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. Whatever the truth of Relez's fall, its effect on the pending cases was immediate. Without their central witness, prosecutors saw some of their strongest murder indictments weaken dramatically. Other participants had come forward, but none could match Relez's breadth of knowledge and apparent willingness to implicate so many. Several murder cases were dropped or reduced. In others, defendants were offered plea deals on lesser charges. In Carbo's situation, the pattern repeated. The most serious accusations based on Relez's expected testimony never fully materialized in court. Carbo did not emerge entirely untouched. In the early 1940s, he was convicted on charges related to weapons and other lesser offenses, reflecting the pattern law enforcement had come to know so well. They believed him responsible for far more serious acts, but could only nail him for carrying guns or for narrower infractions. One such conviction sent him to federal custody for a relatively short term. It was not the catastrophic, life-altering sentence prosecutors had envisioned, but it was a reminder that the risks of remaining a visible enforcer were rising. The whole Murder, Inc. saga marked a turning point for him. Many of his contemporaries from the loosely organized enforcement squads of the 1930s did not survive it. Some went to the electric chair, executed in grim ceremonies at Sing Sing or other state prisons after highly publicized trials. Others disappeared quietly, victims of the same unofficial justice they had once administered. Carbo, by contrast, managed once again to thread the needle, close enough to be named, but not so firmly tied to any one act that a conviction could be secured. If the near miss reinforced his reputation among underworld figures as a lucky and disciplined man, it also underscored a practical truth. The era of the gunman as primary career path was ending. The post-Murder, Inc. landscape pushed many ambitious figures in organized crime away from direct involvement in violence toward more insulated roles in business like rackets. Carbo, whose temperament had always leaned more to quiet efficiency than to dramatic displays, was well suited to this shift. The Second World War accelerated those changes. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States plunged fully into conflict. Young men across the country were drafted or volunteered. Factories retooled to produce weapons, ships, and aircraft. On the docks and in the warehouses, in trucking and in construction, there was more work than anyone could remember seeing during the Depression years. Unions grew in importance, and with them, in some sectors, grew opportunities for extortion and kickbacks. Organized crime adapted quickly. Some bosses traded information with the U.S. Navy about potential sabotage on the waterfront, leveraging their influence over dockworkers into a strange, temporary alignment with national security. Others slipped into the black market, diverting rationed goods like meat, gasoline, and sugar into illicit channels where they could be sold for high prices. In such an environment, direct, conspicuous violence became more dangerous. The federal government was more organized, and the public mood less tolerant of flagrant crime in wartime. Boxing, by contrast, offered a kind of legitimacy wrapped around the same old potential for profit. It fit easily into the wartime culture. Fights served as morale boosters. Posters touted bouts whose proceeds would support war bonds or military charities. Soldiers attended matches on leave. Some bases even staged their own tournaments. Promoters and managers, aware of the patriotic climate, wrapped their events in red, white, and blue. But behind that patriotic veneer, the same pressures and temptations that had always shaped the sport remained, and in some respects, intensified. For the underworld, the war years brought a steady audience and a fresh supply of young fighters. Tough, working-class men, some of them recently returned from combat or military training, saw in boxing a possible escape from factory floors and loading docks. Many came from the same kinds of neighborhoods that had produced Carbo himself. They were strong, ambitious, and almost always short of cash. To finance their training, pay for trainers, and chase opportunities in bigger arenas, they often turned to whoever would front the money. Increasingly, that meant people tied to organized crime. By the early 1940s, Carbo was emerging as a central figure in that environment. He rarely appeared on paperwork. State athletic commissions would never have granted him a manager's license, but his presence was felt. He cultivated relationships with licensed managers who acted as his front men. On paper, these men owned the contracts to boxers. In reality, they often owed a significant cut of those interests to Carbo and his associates. James "Blinky" Palermo, operating primarily out of Philadelphia, was one of those key associates. Palermo, compact and intense, shared Carbo's taste for operating behind the scenes. Over time, the two developed a pattern. They would provide money to managers and promoters in exchange for hidden percentages of fighters' contracts or of specific promotions. In an era before rigorous federal oversight of sports business practices, such arrangements were rarely documented in ways that would satisfy a modern auditor. They were instead understood through a mix of handshake deals, whispered threats, and the very real knowledge that crossing these men could have consequences far beyond the courtroom. The fighters caught in this web did not always see themselves as victims at first. For a young welterweight or lightweight trying to break out of small local shows into larger venues, the promise of steady bouts and access to big-name promoters was persuasive. Carbo and Palermo could deliver that. Their names carried weight with matchmakers who controlled the schedules at major arenas. A manager who boasted that his fighter was, with those men, signaled that he had the backing to secure paying dates and, eventually, title shots. But the hidden costs were considerable. Fighters under this unofficial control often had little say in where or when they fought, or even in some cases whether they would be asked to fight at their best. If a particular bout would benefit certain gamblers or future promotional plans more if it ended one way rather than another, subtle or not so subtle pressure could be applied. Most boxers, proud of their craft and dependent on their reputations, resisted outright fixes. Yet the mere presence of these the book's interests distorted the sport's competitive balance. Meanwhile, Carbo's legal troubles had not vanished entirely. In the mid-1940s, his work took him to the West Coast, where organized crime was extending and formalizing its presence in cities like Los Angeles. The region's race tracks, gambling operations, and burgeoning nightlife offered rich pickings. In that context, Carbo became entangled in a violent incident that finally brought a more serious conviction. In 1944, he was found guilty in California on an assault charge that grew out of an underworld dispute, and received a substantial state prison sentence. He was sent to serve his time in a West Coast facility, again, in an environment where many inmates had connections to organized crime. As at Sing Sing, incarceration did not sever his underworld ties, it merely altered their form. Visitors from back east kept him informed about developments in boxing and in the rackets. Letters, some coded, some apparently mundane, passed information back and forth. Even behind bars, his reputation was not diminished. If anything, a fresh prison term for a violent crime simply reinforced among his peers the image of a man who took risks without talking. Carbo did not serve the full sentence. As had happened before, parole and good time credits shortened his stay. By the time he returned to the East Coast in the latter half of the 1940s, the landscape of boxing and of America had been reshaped again. The war was over. Soldiers and sailors poured home, started families, and went to work or to college on the GI Bill. Cities hummed with new energy. And in living rooms across the country, a new piece of furniture was beginning to appear: the television set. Television would prove transformative for boxing. Unlike baseball or football, which could be difficult to follow on the small early screens, boxing adapted perfectly. Two fighters, a relatively small ring, clear action. It was all easily captured by a few cameras. Networks, hungry for content to fill their schedules, quickly realized that live fights could draw viewers. Sponsors followed. Within a few years, regular fight nights became a staple of early television programming. The new medium changed the economics of the sport. Gate receipts at arenas remained important, but broadcast rights now represented a growing share of the money. Control over which fights would be televised, from which venues, and under what promotional banners became crucial. In this shifting economy, a new entity emerged: the International Boxing Club of New York, often shortened to the IBC, organized by James D. Norris, the wealthy son of a Chicago sportsman, and his associate Arthur Wirtz. Norris and Wirtz, already experienced in promoting hockey and other events, sought and obtained effectively exclusive rights to stage championship fights at key arenas, including Madison Square Garden in New York and the Chicago Stadium. With those contracts in hand, and with television networks eager to deal with a single, organized promoter, the IBC quickly acquired a near monopoly on big-money bouts in the United States. Officially, it was a legitimate corporation, run by respectable businessmen. Unofficially, it relied heavily on relationships with the same underworld forces that had long shaped the sport at the club and regional levels. This was the environment into which Carbo stepped upon his release. Older now, nearing his mid-40s, he was no longer the street corner tough of the Prohibition years or the young torpedo whispered about in Murder, Inc. investigations. Instead, he presented himself as a quiet, businesslike figure who rarely appeared in public at fights, but whose phone calls carried unusual weight. He did not need to sit at ringside to make his presence felt. Through front men and intermediaries, he and Palermo secured interests in fighters who were critical to the IBC's success, leading contenders and reigning champions in multiple weight classes. To athletic commissions and casual fans, these fighters appeared to be managed by a variety of individuals, some competent, some less so, but all within the bounds of the system as it was officially recorded. Only gradually, through investigative reporting and the work of a few determined regulators, would the extent of Carbo's hidden influence begin to emerge. In the late 1940s, the arrangement mostly operated in the shadows, a set of understandings and pressures that insiders recognized but rarely acknowledged out loud. For Carbo personally, this represented a profound evolution. He had moved from the dangerous front lines of street enforcement to the comparatively insulated position of a shadow investor and power broker in a sport beloved by millions. The threats he relied on were now often implicit rather than explicit. The violence he had once dispensed personally, now more a backdrop than a daily tool. Yet the core of his role remained rooted in the same realities that had shaped him as a boy in the tenements. The law's difficulty in piercing tight-lipped communities, the vulnerability of the poor to exploitation, and the allure of fast money in a system where the official routes to success remained, for many, narrow and blocked. By the close of the 1940s, Frank Carbo stood at the intersection of organized crime and organized sport, a man whose name was known to police and to certain promoters and managers, but barely at all to the general public. That obscurity suited him. In an era when fighters' names lit up marquees and promoters posed for photographers in tailored suits, he was content to remain a shadowy presence. From that position, he was about to exert a level of control over boxing that would, within a decade, draw the attention not only of sports writers and prosecutors, but of the United States Senate itself. In the years just after the Second World War, Friday nights in America began to revolve around a strange new ritual. Living rooms glowed with the bluish light of early television sets. Families pulled chairs close. Neighbors knocked on doors asking if they could come over. On the small, flickering screens, under bright lights in smoky arenas, two men in trunks moved around a square ring, their movements narrated by rapid-fire announcers. Sponsors hawked shaving cream and cigarettes between rounds. For millions, this was their first regular window into big-time sport. The program guide simply called it Fight Night. Behind that familiar phrase, hidden from the cameras, stood a short, unsmiling man who had quietly made himself indispensable, Frank Carbo. When Carbo returned from his California prison term in the mid-1940s, the boxing world he re-entered was both familiar and newly promising. The old patterns were still there. Small club shows in neighborhood arenas, larger cards at Madison Square Garden and municipal stadiums, and a sport run by a mix of ex-fighters, local businessmen, and sharp-eyed hustlers. But a new layer had been added. Television networks, just finding their footing, had discovered that boxing was perfect for the medium. They needed a steady stream of fighters and bouts to fill their schedules. Promoters who could guarantee that stream stood to make far more money than previous generations had ever imagined. Two Midwestern businessmen understood this opportunity more quickly and more completely than most. James D. Norris and Arthur Wirtz, already experienced in promoting hockey and other events, began to knit together control of the most important boxing venues and television rights. In 1949, they organized the International Boxing Club of New York, the IBC, which soon obtained long-term leases and exclusive promotional contracts with Madison Square Garden, the Chicago Stadium, and other key arenas. Within a few short years, almost every world championship fight in the United States would run through their office. On paper, the IBC was the face of modern corporate boxing: board meetings, contracts, lawyers, and television negotiations. But the IBC could not function without a steady supply of marketable fighters, and the supply of fighters, especially in the talent-rich welterweight and lightweight divisions, ran through less visible channels. Many of the most promising contenders were already entangled in financial arrangements with underworld figures by the time they reached the level the IBC cared about. If Norris and Wirtz wanted to stage the biggest fights, they had to deal, directly or indirectly, with the men who owned significant pieces of those fighters' contracts. Chief among those men was Carbo. He did not appear on letterhead or stock certificates. He held no manager's license from any state athletic commission. Officially, he had nothing to do with the IBC's operations. In reality, he and his longtime associate James "Blinky" Palermo acted as a kind of shadow syndicate, controlling slices of many fighters' careers. Licensed managers, often men without deep pockets of their own, entered into quiet understandings with Carbo and Palermo. In return for financial backing, protection, and access to meaningful bouts, they assigned portions of their fighters' earnings or contract rights to these silent partners. The arrangement could be simple or elaborate. In some cases, a manager would sign over a percentage of all future purses to a company or individual chosen by Carbo, sometimes for a lump sum payment that seemed generous in the moment but proved paltry over time. In others, the deal was less formal, a handshake agreement that a certain part of every payday would find its way back to specific underworld creditors. In either form, the effect was the same. A growing stable of fighters at the top and near top levels of the sport were, in a real but unrecorded sense, working not just for their public managers, but for Carbo. Ike Williams, the brilliant lightweight champion of the late 1940s, was among those caught up in these arrangements. Williams came from hard circumstances and had fought his way up through grueling club shows. As he began to headline big cards and appear on television, it might have seemed that his financial future was secure. Yet years later, when his career had ended, Williams told reporters and investigators that much of the money that should have been his had been siphoned off. He described signing papers he did not fully understand and seeing large chunks of his purses vanish to pay off shadowy partners. Among the names he associated with these losses were Carbo and Palermo. He was hardly alone. Not every fighter fully grasped the web they were entering. Many were young, some barely out of their teens, more comfortable in the ring than in an office. Contracts were often long and densely worded. In some cases, managers presented new arrangements as mere formalities, a way to get in with the right people in order to secure a title shot or a television date. The pressure to agree could be intense. To refuse was to risk being starved of meaningful bouts, trapped fighting low-purse opponents on obscure undercards while others, more compliant, moved ahead. At the same time that Carbo's grip on fighters was tightening, state regulators were becoming increasingly uneasy. Commissions like the New York State Athletic Commission began to hear whispers from trainers, cutmen, and a few courageous managers about underworld influence. Certain booking offices, informal clearinghouses that matched fighters to bouts, had reputations as places where, in the words of one later witness, nothing moved unless certain people got their piece. When commissioners inquired too pointedly or tried to block suspect managers, they often found themselves up against a wall of silence. One incident in particular jolted regulators and fans alike. The December 1947 bout at Madison Square Garden between crowd favorite Jake LaMotta and a little-known opponent, Billy Fox. On paper, LaMotta should have had little trouble. Instead, in front of a confused and increasingly angry audience, he fought in a strangely listless way, absorbing punches, making little effort to defend himself effectively, and offering none of the furious rallies that had made his reputation. The referee stopped the fight in the fourth round, giving Fox a technical knockout victory. Rumors that the bout had been fixed spread immediately. The New York Boxing Commission launched an investigation, but with no fighter willing at that time to admit wrongdoing, and with no direct evidence beyond the obvious oddness of the performance, formal action stalled. The stain, however, remained. Years later, LaMotta would admit under oath that he had been paid to lose to Fox as part of an arrangement designed to curry favor with the underworld in exchange for a long-sought middleweight title shot. In his testimony and subsequent accounts, the name that appeared behind Fox's management, and thus behind the fix, was Frank Carbo. The LaMotta-Fox affair, along with other suspicious-looking fights, fueled growing concern that the sport's outcomes were not always what they seemed. Sports writers like A.J. Liebling and others began to hint in print at unseen hands shaping the ring's narratives. Some, more blunt, called for investigations into crookedness in boxing. The problem, as always, was proving anything to the standard required in court. Fighters were reluctant to endanger themselves by nomming those they feared. Promoters and managers, many of whom had at least some entanglement with underworld figures, had little incentive to press the matter. While state commissions wrestled with limited tools, a broader federal spotlight was swinging in Carbo's direction. In 1950, the U.S. Senate created the Special Committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce, chaired by Senator S. Kefauver of Tennessee. The Kefauver Committee, as the press dubbed it, set out to expose the structure of organized crime in America. It held hearings in cities around the country: New York, Chicago, New Orleans, Miami, subpoenaing mob bosses, bookmakers, corrupt officials, and anyone else it believed could illuminate the workings of the national underworld. The hearings were broadcast live on television, making them one of the earliest political spectacles of the medium. Ordinary Americans, sitting in their living rooms in the same positions they occupied for Friday night fights, now watched shadowy figures from newspaper crime pages being sworn in, questioned, and sometimes cornered under bright questioning. It was in this context, in 1951, that Frank Carbo was summoned to testify. He was not as famous as some of the other witnesses. Names like Frank Costello and Mayor Lansky drew more immediate attention. Yet within the world of boxing and among law enforcement officials, Carbo's appearance was closely watched. Committee staff had compiled substantial background on him: his old manslaughter conviction, his alleged ties to Murder, Inc., his California assault case, and his growing unseen role in the fight game. Reporters were eager to see how this man, often described in police files as taciturn and self-possessed, would handle the very public pressure of a Senate interrogation. The scene in the hearing room reflected the drama of the moment. Senators sat in a row behind raised desks, papers stacked before them, microphones angled just so. Carbo in a plain suit took his place at the witness table. Cameras buzzed. Flashbulbs popped. Kefauver and his colleagues asked him about his background, his associations with known gang figures, and his involvement in boxing. Did he, as some witnesses had suggested, own parts of champions and contenders? Had he arranged or attempted to arrange specific fights or outcomes? What were his business relationships with James Norris and the IBC? To each substantive question, Carbo leaned toward the microphone and responded in a flat, almost bored tone that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. He refused to answer on the ground that his response might tend to incriminate him. Again and again, sometimes with slight variations in wording, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right. He volunteered nothing. He denied nothing. Senators grew visibly frustrated. At one point, Kefauver remarked to colleagues that figures like Carbo seemed to regard such proceedings as nuisances rather than real threats. For television audiences, the stonewalling was infuriating or fascinating, depending on their perspective. The Kefauver Committee's final reports would single out Carbo as one of the leading underworld figures in boxing, describing him as an unofficial commissioner with widespread influence over the sport. Yet in strictly legal terms, the hearing changed little for him. There was no perjury indictment to follow. No new charges immediately resulted. He walked out of the chamber the same way he had walked in, a free man, his reputation in the shadows ironically enlarged by his brief exposure to national scrutiny. If anything, the attention may have reinforced in his mind how narrow and fragile the bridge was between suspicion and conviction. As long as he avoided putting his name on official documents, as long as his financial interests were shielded by intermediaries, and as long as those intermediaries remained loyal or frightened, investigators would struggle to pin specific acts on him. He appears to have responded not by retreating from boxing, but by refining his methods, keeping one more layer removed from day-to-day dealings, relying even more heavily on trusted lieutenants like Palermo and on seemingly legitimate associates in the IBC orbit. The early 1950s thus became, paradoxically, both the period of Carbo's greatest exposure and of his greatest practical control. The IBC's near monopoly on championship fights meant that any fighter with title ambitions inevitably passed through a relatively small group of matchmakers and promoters. At the same time, Carbo's network of hidden contract interests continued to expand. By mid-decade, investigative reporters and later congressional inquiries would conclude that he and his partners held stakes, sometimes substantial ones, in a striking number of leading boxers. Johnny Saxton, a welterweight whose career would later become a focal point of scandal, was among those reportedly under Carbo and Palermo's influence. Saxton rose quickly through the ranks in the early 1950s, earning a reputation as a cautious but effective boxer. When he received a world title shot against legend Kid Gavilan in 1954, many observers were surprised. Others, more familiar with the sport's backstage arrangements, suspected that forces beyond pure merit were at work. Saxton won a controversial decision. Ringside reporters and many fans booed, convinced Gavilan had done enough to retain his title. Whispers that the fight had been arranged in some way began almost immediately. Nothing was proved in court about that bout at the time, yet it fit a pattern. When certain fighters managed or secretly controlled by underworld figures received opportunities that seemed disproportionate to their records, and when those opportunities resulted in close, unpopular decisions, suspicion naturally fell on the network that had become boxing's open secret. It wasn't always a matter of outright fixes. Sometimes influence worked in subtler ways. Matchmaking could be tailored to favor certain fighters' styles. Referees and judges, then chosen with far less transparency than today, could be selected from pools known to be sympathetic to particular promoters. For fighters on the outside of this network, the situation was dispiriting. Men who refused to sign contracts that would cut in Carbo's people sometimes found themselves perpetually bypassed. They would see boxers they had beaten, or believed they could beat, leapfrog them into television main events and title eliminators. A few spoke out cautiously to friendly reporters, complaining of politics or influences ruining the sport, but almost none dared name names while still active. The risk to their livelihoods, and they feared to their safety, was too great. Among fans and honest promoters, resentment grew. They watched as what should have been straightforward questions of merit became entangled with the calculations of gamblers and racketeers. Promoters who tried to operate without underworld entanglements found it difficult to secure the best fighters, or were pressured through threats of boycotts and disruptions. Some gave in, others left the sport altogether. The IBC's dominance, combined with Carbo's backstage reach, left little room for independent operations at the highest levels. Yet the very concentration of power that made Carbo so effective in those years also made him and his associates attractive targets for a new wave of federal inquiries. The Kefauver hearings had been about organized crime in general. By the mid-1950s, antitrust regulators began to look specifically at whether the IBC's control over championship fights violated competition laws. In 1955, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that professional boxing promotions fell under federal antitrust statutes, clearing the way for the Justice Department to pursue the IBC in court. As antitrust suits moved forward against Norris and his corporation, parallel investigations by the Justice Department and Senate subcommittees delved into the underworld side of the sport. They examined who really owned what, and why so many top fighters seemed to be clustered around a handful of shadowy figures. Subpoenas went out not just to promoters and network executives, but to managers, trainers, and fighters who might shed light on the hidden ownership of contracts. In previous years, such witnesses might have kept quiet. Now, with public frustration at corruption rising and with some men retired from or pushed out of the sport, more were willing to talk. What emerged over the second half of the decade was a clearer, though still incomplete, picture of the machinery Frank Carbo had helped build. Testimony described how certain managers were mere fronts, signing fighters to contracts that had already been effectively promised to Carbo and Palermo. Financial records, when investigators could get them, showed odd streams of money flowing from promoters to shell companies, and then to individuals known in police files as underworld operatives. The notion of Carbo as boxing, silent partner, ceased to be only a rumor in gyms. It appeared in cautious bureaucratic language in government reports. Publicly, Carbo remained almost as opaque as ever. He rarely gave interviews. When photographed, usually leaving a courthouse or arriving at a hearing, he appeared as he always had, tidy suit, expression unreadable. He let lawyers speak for him when necessary and otherwise kept his own counsel. To some in the underworld, this composure under pressure was admirable. To those trying to clean up boxing, it was maddening. They knew that behind that calm face lay years of influence that had twisted their sport. Proving it, in ways that could lead to lasting change, was another matter. By the edge of the 1960s, however, the circle was tightening. Antitrust actions would soon dismantle the IBC's monopoly. A new Senate inquiry would turn its full attention to professional boxing, probing deeper than ever into Carbo's role. And one particular case, involving a welterweight title and a network of threats and extortion around a single fight, would finally produce the kind of courtroom reckoning that had eluded prosecutors for so long. After decades operating in the penumbra between rumor and formal charge, Frank Carbo was moving toward a confrontation he could not indefinitely avoid. As the 1950s moved into their second half, the neat lines on promotional posters, World Welterweight Championship, World Middleweight Championship, hit a messy and increasingly fragile structure. To the public, boxing looked bigger than ever. Friday night television fights still pulled strong ratings. Arenas in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia filled when titles were at stake. But behind the scenes, lawyers and investigators were steadily prying at the foundations that had allowed a handful of businessmen and racketeers to dominate the sport. At the center of that contested ground, still largely unseen but more frequently named in official reports, stood Frank Carbo. The first serious blow to the system that had nourished him did not come from a criminal court at all, but from the antitrust laws. The Justice Department's case against the International Boxing Club, filed in the early 1950s, finally reached the Supreme Court in 1955. The government argued that Norris and Wirtz's near-exclusive control over championship bouts in major arenas constituted an illegal restraint of trade under the Sherman Act. The IBC's lawyers countered that boxing promotions were local events, not the kind of interstate commerce Congress had meant to regulate, and that the sport needed centralized organization to function. The justices disagreed. In United States v. International Boxing Club of New York, they held that boxing promotions, particularly heavily advertised championship fights broadcast across state lines, did fall within the scope of federal antitrust law. That decision did not instantly dissolve the IBC, but it set the stage for lower court orders that, over the next few years, broke up its monopoly. By the end of the decade, Norris and Wirtz were effectively forced out of the championship fight business. The corporate face of the old system was gone. To many observers, this seemed like a chance for a fresh start. Without the IBC, perhaps independent promoters could compete more fairly. Perhaps state commissions could reassert control. Yet the departure of Norris and his formal organization did not, by itself, disconnect the underworld from the sport. The habits and relationships that had grown up under the IBC's umbrella, hidden contract interests, quiet deals enforced by fear, remained in place. In that more fragmented, less regulated environment, a figure like Carbo, who had always operated behind the scenes, could in some respects move more freely. State regulators were not blind to this. The New York State Athletic Commission, long the most powerful in the country, had been uneasy about Carbo since at least the late 1940s. After the first Kefauver hearings and a series of suspicious bouts, the commission formally barred him from any participation in licensed boxing in the state. He could not receive a manager's license, hold a promoter's permit, or be recognized in any official capacity. Other state commissions issued similar prohibitions. Lists circulated of undesirable persons who were to be kept away from dressing rooms and offices on fight night. On paper, these bans looked decisive. In practice, they were porous. Carbo rarely needed to set foot in an arena to make his wishes known. Licensed managers who fronted for him could enter unhindered. Intermediaries could meet fighters in hotel rooms or training camps beyond the sight of commission inspectors. If Carbo wanted to attend a bout in New York, he could do so under a different name, sitting back from ringside. The formal barriers, while symbolically important, did little to cut the threads of influence he had woven through contracts and personal loyalties. Those threads extended into some of the era's most high-profile and controversial fights. The welterweight division, in particular, became a focal point of suspicion. In 1954, Johnny Saxton's contentious decision victory over Kid Gavilan had already raised eyebrows. 2 years later, when Saxton defended his title against Carmen Basilio, the sense that forces beyond the ring were at work only deepened. Basilio, a rugged, crowd-pleasing fighter from upstate New York, had won the recognition of the boxing public with his relentless style. He and his manager, Joe Netro, pushed hard for a shot at Saxton's title. They found, as others had before them, that the route to a championship in that era often ran through people who were not listed on the bout contracts. Testimony and accounts that would emerge years later describe intense pressure on Basilio's camp to accept certain financial arrangements in order to secure the match, arrangements that would funnel a substantial share of Basilio's future earnings to interests connected to Carbo and Blinky Palermo. The first Basilio-Saxton fight, held in March 1956 in Chicago, ended in another hotly disputed decision. Ringside reporters and many fans believed Basilio's aggression and cleaner punching had earned him the victory. The judges saw it differently, awarding Saxton the nod. The reaction was immediate. Boos rained down. Some spectators hurled debris. Sports writers, more openly than before, hinted that the outcome might not have been purely the product of the fighter's efforts. When Basilio got a rematch in Rochester, New York later that year, and stopped Saxton decisively, the uproar subsided somewhat. Yet the pair of fights, sandwiching a controversial decision between two performances many observers saw as more representative of the fighters' relative abilities, became emblematic of an era when championship belts seemed to move in patterns that aligned with the underworld's financial interests. Even without hard evidence of outright fixes, the perception that certain fighters belonged to certain families of influence was corrosive. This perception was not confined to journalists and fans. By the late 1950s, the Senate's Subcommittee on Antitrust and Monopoly, still under the chairmanship of S. Kefauver, turned its attention squarely to professional boxing. Separate from the earlier broad crime hearings, this new investigation examined both economic concentration and corruption in the sport. Over months of sessions in 1959 and 1960, the subcommittee called promoters, television executives, commissioners, and, crucially, fighters themselves. The hearings produced some of the most startling public admissions in boxing's history. Jake LaMotta, now retired and removed from the daily pressures of the fight game, took the stand and was pressed about his strange 1947 loss to Billy Fox. This time, unlike in earlier inquiries, he did not dissemble. Under oath, LaMotta admitted that he had deliberately lost the fight. He described being approached with an offer. If he agreed to go down to Fox, operated by interests tied into the Carbo-Palermo web, he would be helped toward a middleweight title shot. Money changed hands. The fix was arranged. LaMotta's later victory over Marcel Cerdan and his reign as champion took on, in retrospect, a different hue. Another former champion, Ike Williams, testified about how little he had ultimately received from his lucrative run as lightweight king. He recounted signing contracts that diverted large shares of his earnings to managers and backers linked to organized crime. When he tried to break free or question the arrangements, fights became harder to obtain. By the time he retired, despite headlining for major purses, he was far from wealthy. His story illustrated the structural exploitation that Carbo's kind of hidden ownership made possible. Throughout this parade of witnesses, Carbo's name recurred. Senators and staff attorneys asked, "Who really owned your contract? Who controlled whom you fought and when? In whose office did you sign your papers, and who stood nearby making their expectations clear?" Even when fighters or managers avoided saying his name directly, references to the boys, or those people operating out of certain known addresses left little doubt about whom they meant. In its interim reports, the subcommittee was blunt, describing Carbo as holding an unofficial but powerful position in boxing, exercising control over a substantial number of fighters. Once again, Carbo himself was summoned. Once again, he invoked the Fifth Amendment to almost every substantive question. To angered senators, it looked like open defiance. To Carbo, it was consistent self-preservation. He had watched others, some of them former associates from Murder, Inc., days send themselves to the electric chair or long prison terms with careless words. He would not make that mistake. The spectacle of yet another hearing where he appeared, but said virtually nothing, deepened his notoriety without producing immediate legal consequences. Yet the cumulative weight of testimony from fighters and insiders did more than darken his reputation. It helped federal investigators map, in greater detail, the network through which Carbo and Palermo operated. Names of front men came into clearer focus. Patterns of intimidation were described under oath. Threats of canceled fights, harm to careers, and sometimes implicitly harm to bodies if managers or boxers did not cooperate. One of those who experienced such pressure firsthand, and who ultimately chose to go to authorities, was a West Coast manager named Don Nesseth. Nesseth handled the career of Don Jordan, a talented young Californian who captured the world welterweight title in 1958. Jordan, unlike some of the East Coast fighters long in the orbit of Carbo's organization, had come up outside that system. His sudden possession of a valuable championship belt made him immediately interesting to those who believed they ought to have a stake in every major title. According to Nesseth's later testimony, representatives of Carbo and Palermo approached him with demands. They insisted on acquiring a significant share of Jordan's contract. Figures of 50% or more were mentioned in some accounts, in exchange for vague promises of protection and continued access to major fights. These were not negotiations between equal commercial partners. When Neseth balked, the tone darkened. Hints were dropped about what might happen to Jordan's career if he remained unrepresented in the right circles. More ominous suggestions, touching on the physical safety of those involved, were allegedly made. This time, however, the manager did not quietly acquiesce or retreat. Perhaps emboldened by the atmosphere created by the Senate hearings, perhaps simply unwilling to hand over control of his fighter to men with such reputations, Neseth went to law enforcement. He laid out the pattern of approaches and threats, naming names. Federal prosecutors, already building a broader case on Carbo's role in interstate boxing commerce, seized on the opportunity. Here was something concrete, a specific attempt, crossing state lines, to extort contractual rights through intimidation. In 1960, a federal grand jury in California indicted Carbo, Palermo, and several associates on charges of conspiracy and extortion related to their efforts to take over Don Jordan's contract. Among those named alongside them was Truman Gibson, an African-American attorney and former executive with the International Boxing Club, who had done legal work in the sport for years. Gibson, who denied any involvement in coercion, insisted he had only participated in legitimate business dealings. He would later be acquitted, but the inclusion of his name underlined how entangled the formal structures of post-IBC boxing still were with the shadow economy Carbo had nurtured. Carbo's arrest in this case marked a qualitative shift from the pattern of his earlier brushes with the law. This was not a weapons charge or a vague, witness-dependent homicide allegation. The extortion statute used by federal prosecutors tied to interstate commerce gave them a more flexible and powerful tool. The climate had changed, too. Public tolerance for the idea that certain sports, naturally, involved some underworld presence was lower than it had been in the 1930s or even the immediate post-war years. The Kefauver and antitrust hearings had created a sense, among many Americans, that something fundamental about fairness was at stake. Taken into custody, Carbo was now in his mid-50s, thick-set but no longer physically imposing. Years of stress and a long-standing heart condition had taken their toll. Nonetheless, the government treated him as the serious figure they believed him to be. Bail was set high. The press, by now used to writing about him as boxing's underworld boss or czar of the fight game, splashed his name across headlines once more. Photographs showed him being led by marshals, face as impassive as ever. The trial, held in federal court in Los Angeles in 1961, laid out in methodical detail the government's version of events. Neseth and other witnesses testified about meetings, phone calls, and veiled threats. Documentary evidence, including contracts and correspondence, helped establish the economic stakes. Prosecutors presented the case as part of a broader pattern, the systematic attempt by organized crime figures to dominate championship boxing through intimidation and hidden ownership. The defense countered that disagreements over contracts and percentages, however heated, were not crimes, that Neseth had exaggerated for his own reasons, and that Carbo and Palermo were being scapegoated for a wider culture of sharp dealing. They sought to distance their clients from any direct threat, portraying them as businessmen whose names were being misused by overzealous underlings. As in earlier cases, they pointed to the lack of recordings or written threats. This was still an era before wiretaps were commonplace in such prosecutions. This time, the jury was not persuaded. In November 1961, after weeks of testimony, Carbo and Palermo were convicted of extortion and conspiracy. When sentencing came early the following year, the penalties reflected both the seriousness of the specific offense and the court's view of their broader impact on the sport. Carbo received a 25-year federal prison sentence. Palermo, somewhat younger and viewed as slightly less central, was given 15 years. Other co-defendants received shorter terms or, in Gibson's case, were acquitted. For Carbo, it was by far the longest sentence he had ever faced. The verdict reverberated through boxing. For decades, insiders had spoken in low voices of his hold over fighters and managers. Now, at last, a court had formally recognized and punished that pattern. While the conviction rested on one case, involving Don Jordan, its symbolic weight was much greater. It signaled that the federal government was prepared to treat the manipulation of sports by organized crime not as a colorful sideline, but as a serious matter affecting interstate commerce and public confidence. Physically, the impact on Carbo was immediate and severe. He entered the federal prison system as an aging man with significant health issues. He would pass through institutions including the maximum security penitentiary at McNeil Island in Washington state, and later, Leavenworth in Kansas, spending much of his time under medical supervision. Gone were the days when a sentence could be turned into an extended networking opportunity, as it had been in his youth. The world outside was changing rapidly. Television was maturing, other sports were rising, and a new generation of promoters was beginning to reshape boxing without him. From his cell, he could read about these changes in newspapers and letters. He would have seen stories about the gradual dismantling of the old title structures, the rise of new sanctioning bodies, and the continuing efforts of state commissions to insulate the sport from the kind of influence he had once exerted so confidently. Whatever satisfaction he might have taken in the knowledge that many of the systems he had helped build still echoed in the sport's structure, those echoes were now distant and largely beyond his control. For the boxers who had lived under his shadow, the conviction was a complex moment. Some, like Basilio and LaMotta, told reporters they felt a grim sense of vindication. The man they had long blamed for distorting their careers and their sport had finally been held to account. Others, still active and wary of being associated too publicly with any side in the matter, stayed silent. Many younger fighters entering the game in the 1960s knew Carbo only as a cautionary story, a name invoked in tales of how bad things once were and how much cleaner, or at least more regulated, the present was supposed to be. In a real sense, then, the Don Jordan extortion case marked the end of an era. For roughly 3 decades, from the final days of Prohibition through the television boom of the 1950s, Frank Carbo had been a constant, if mostly unseen, presence in the American underworld and in its most bruising sport. He had adapted from street gunman to behind-the-scenes power broker, from the rough justice of Murder, Inc., to the subtler coercion of contract control. Now, for the first time, the consequences of that evolution had caught up with him in a way he could not evade. The remaining years of his life would be spent not in smoky meeting rooms and crowded arenas, but in the regimented, narrow world of federal prisons, watching from a distance as both the underworld and the sport that had made his name moved on without him. The iron door clanged shut behind him with a finality that no courtroom gavel could match. In early 1962, after the trial in Lowe's Angels and the long, tense wait for sentencing, Frank Carbo was processed into the federal prison system to begin serving 25 years for conspiracy and extortion. At intake, clerks recorded the same basic facts that had followed him since he was a boy in New York. Born 1904, medium height, stocky build, dark hair now receding, brown eyes. They added new lines: arterial disease, hypertension, a chronically weak heart. He was sent first to a high-security federal penitentiary. Records and later accounts place him at McNeil Island in Washington state, among other institutions, far from the Manhattan streets and Philadelphia gyms where his reputation had been made. There were no back rooms to slip into, no ringside shadows to disappear in. For the first time since his teenage years, his daily schedule was dictated almost entirely by others. Counts at fixed hours, meals on a rigid timetable, lights out by rule. Prison files and press reports from the period suggest that Carbo was, in many ways, an unremarkable inmate. He was in his late 50s, no longer physically imposing, and by then more a symbol of a bygone era than an active field commander. Guards who spoke to reporters after his conviction described him as quiet, obedient to institutional rules, and often under medical supervision. He was not the kind of volatile prisoner who caused daily headaches for staff. The danger he posed had always been in what he could arrange outside the walls, not in any capacity for revolt within them. That outside capacity, however, was now sharply limited. The communication channels he had once relied on, late-night phone calls, discreet meetings. Messages passed through associates, were screened or severed. He could still receive letters and visitors, but both were subject to monitoring. Federal prison officials of the early 1960s were well aware of who he was. They had no intention of letting him use the penitentiary as a remote headquarters for continuing to influence boxing or the rackets. Appeals moved forward on his extortion conviction, as they did in most major federal cases. His attorneys argued that pretrial publicity and his long-standing reputation had made a fair hearing in Lowe's Angels impossible, that the jury had been prejudiced by stories branding him the czar of boxing's underworld. They challenged aspects of the trial judge's rulings on evidence and procedure. The case Carbo v. United States went up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where the judges reviewed the record with care. In 1963, they affirmed the conviction, rejecting claims that publicity and courtroom errors had denied him due process. Petitions to the Supreme Court went nowhere. Legally, the matter was settled. He would remain where he was. While Carbo adjusted to the regimen of federal time, the sport he had once gripped so tightly was entering a new, turbulent chapter without him. In 1962, a brash, poetic young heavyweight named Cassius Clay upset Sonny Liston to become champion, soon announcing his conversion to Islam and new name, Muhammad Ali. Over the next decade, Ali's refusal to be drafted, his suspension from boxing, and his eventual return in classic bouts against Joe Frazier and George Foreman would dominate the sporting pages. In those heavyweight dramas, Carbo's hand was largely absent. If his name surfaced at all in relation to the big men of the 1960s and early 1970s, it was usually as a reference point, a reminder of how deeply the mob had once penetrated boxing, contrasted with the somewhat more diffuse, though still real, underworld presence of the new era. Investigative reporting into Sonny Liston's management, for instance, revealed connections to St. Louis and Las Vegas mob figures, but did not place Carbo at the center of those arrangements. His time as the indispensable fixer of big-time boxing had passed. That did not mean the structures he had helped develop simply vanished. The idea that a fighter's contract could be sliced into hidden percentages, with shares held by people whose names never appeared on official documents, remained part of the sport's culture. Some of the managers and second-tier promoters who had once fronted for him continued in business, now answering to other figures. A younger generation of hustlers and would-be promoters looked at what Carbo and Palermo had done, and in some cases, tried to imitate their methods on a smaller scale. Outside the sport, America itself was changing in ways that would have been unimaginable when Carbo first started doing muscle work for the Lucchese family. The civil rights movement challenged segregated social structures. Mass protests demanded new forms of accountability from institutions. Television, the very medium that had amplified his invisible power in the 1950s, now brought images of marches, riots, and war into homes nightly. Within government, a quieter revolution in legal tools was underway. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, giving prosecutors a potent new way to target not just individual crimes, but the patterns and enterprises behind them. To the architects of RICO and related reforms, figures like Frank Carbo stood as case studies in the difficulty of dismantling entrenched criminal influence with traditional tools alone. For decades, he had evaded major convictions by avoiding direct involvement in clearly provable acts, delegating violence and intimidation to others, and keeping his name off contracts. RICO was designed in part to reach such people, allowing prosecutors to argue that overseeing a pattern of extortion and corruption within an enterprise was itself a crime. Ironically, by the time the law was in place and being applied broadly, Carbo was already locked away on the kind of conviction RICO might have made easier to secure years earlier. Inside prison, his health steadily worsened. Contemporaneous accounts note heart trouble and circulatory problems. He spent time in prison hospitals and infirmaries, where daily life was quieter, but even more tightly monitored. The tough composure that had carried him through earlier stints in Senate inquisitions now faced a different sort of test: the slow narrowing of an aging body in an institution built to restrain even the healthy. The press did not entirely forget him. From time to time, particularly when new scandals erupted in boxing or when Congress or state legislatures held fresh hearings on sports corruption, his name would appear as a reference point. Articles would retell in shorthand the story: the Lower East Side boy who became a Murder, Inc. gunman, then boxing's shadow commissioner, finally brought down by an extortion case involving a welterweight champion. Reporters called prisons for quotes. Carbo rarely obliged. On the few occasions when a line from him made it into print, it was brief and non-revealing. He maintained his innocence in the Jordan case, or said simply that he had paid his debt and wanted to be left alone. Meanwhile, within the sport, the shadow he cast continued to shape reform efforts. State athletic commissions, prodded by legislators and public opinion, tightened some of their rules. They expanded background checks for managers and promoters, explicitly barring anyone with serious felony convictions or known organized crime ties from holding licenses. New York, still the sport's most symbolically important regulator, broadened its list of undesirable persons, excluded from ringside and dressing room access. In hearings and policy papers, officials invoked Carbo by name as the sort of figure they were determined to keep out forever. At the federal level, congressional committees revisited boxing periodically. In 1969 and the early 1970s, further hearings examined the sport's economic structure, safety issues, and lingering corruption. Witnesses, some veterans of the Kefauver era, others newer to the scene, told familiar stories about questionable decisions, dubious contracts, and the vulnerability of poorly educated fighters. Though Carbo was now physically removed from the ring's orbit, his name still appeared in opening statements as a touchstone, almost a shorthand for "this is what happens when we allow criminals to run a sport." The symbolic value of that name grew even as the living man faded from daily relevance. Books on organized crime and on boxing's dark side, published in the 1960s and early 1970s, devoted chapters to him. Journalists and historians pieced together his life from court transcripts, law enforcement files, and interviews with ex-fighters and ex-associates. Bud Schulberg's 1947 novel, The Harder They Fall, and the subsequent film adaptation, though written before his conviction and drawing on multiple sources, were now often read as fictionalized portraits of the world he had dominated. A corrupt fight game in which a mob-controlled heavyweight is carefully built up and then destroyed. Sports essayists like A.J. Liebling had, in earlier years, sketched the outlines of his influence in their accounts of suspicious bouts and whispered threats. Now, those sketches were filled in with details from Senate reports and trial records. For the men who had lived and worked under him, reading these accounts from the outside world could be a complex experience. Some, like Jake LaMotta and Carmen Basilio, spoke candidly in interviews and autobiographies about the era's crookedness. They described Carbo not as an all-powerful puppet master pulling every string, but as the central figure in a network that enforced its will more through structural control and implied menace than through constant direct orders. Others, particularly those who had once benefited from access to big fights and television money through his patronage, were more circumspect or defensive, minimizing his role or dismissing the stories as exaggerations. What was clear, even amid those disagreements, was that the sport's institutional memory of him had become ambivalent at best. On one hand, there was a certain grim fascination with the sheer breadth of his reach in his prime. How one relatively obscure man, rarely quoted, almost never photographed at ringside, had managed to mold an entire industry's top tier around his interests. On the other, there was growing recognition of the damage that reach had done, to fighters cheated out of rightful earnings, to public confidence in results, and to the possibility of a more open, merit-based competition. The contrast with emerging figures in boxing promotion underscored this uneasy legacy. In the 1970s, a new wave of flamboyant promoters began to dominate headlines, men who styled themselves as impresarios and showmen, making their reputations as much on their television personas as on their matchmaking skills. Some of them had their own brushes with the law or with underworld circles earlier in life. But they operated in a different media environment, under more intense scrutiny from reporters and regulators sensitized by the Carbo era. Where he had thrived in the shadows, they thrived, or tried to, under the glare. By the mid-1970s, Carbo's own story was clearly nearing its end. Years of confinement and chronic illness left him frail. Friends and relatives petitioned for his release on humanitarian grounds, citing his deteriorating heart and the limited threat an aging, sick man could pose. Parole boards weighed those requests against the seriousness of his crimes and the symbolic message any early release might send. In the end, age and infirmity tipped the scales. After serving roughly half of his sentence, Frank Carbo was paroled in 1976 on medical grounds. He left the federal system not as the formidable, tight-lipped operator who had faced down senators, but as a 70-something ex-convict moving slowly, with the aid of doctors, and, according to some accounts, family members living in Florida. He settled in Miami Beach, a city where, by then, many veterans of the old Northeast underworld had drifted to live out their final years in a climate more forgiving than the concrete winters of New York. There were no triumphant homecomings, no celebrations from old associates in boxing. The sport had moved on. New names filled the headlines. Younger fans knew his only dimly, if at all. In Miami, his last months were quiet. He was occasionally mentioned in passing in local gossip or crime columns, former boxing figure now residing in the area, but he did not reappear as an active force. Whatever fragments of influence he might theoretically have retained were overwhelmed by his failing health and the distance in time from his heyday. On November 10, 1976, Frankie Carbo died of natural causes, his long troubled heart finally giving out. He was 72 years old. The notice of his death, carried in wire service summaries and obituaries, was brief compared to the impact he had once had. Most accounts followed a familiar template: birth in New York's Italian Quarter, early conviction for manslaughter, alleged membership in Murder, Inc., ascent as a hidden power in boxing, Senate appearances marked by stonewalling, and final downfall in the Don Jordan extortion case. A few added color from interviews with fighters whose careers had intersected with his. Almost all emphasized the same central theme: that for a crucial span of mid-20th century boxing, he had wielded a degree of clandestine control unmatched before or since. In the years that followed, as historians and regulators continued to dissect the sport's past, his life would be re-examined again and again. Some writers saw in his story a cautionary tale about what happens when poverty, prejudice, and lax oversight combine to leave whole professions vulnerable to organized crime. Others read it as a window into the broader operations of the American underworld in the 20th century, with boxing simply one of many economic frontiers it colonized. for those who had cheered in smoky arenas in the 1940s and 1950s, or had gathered around small television sets on Friday nights. The realization that so many of those contests had been shaped behind the scenes by a man they never saw was sobering. By the time his name faded from fresh news and settled into history books, the sport he had once bent to his will was still wrestling with many of the same structural issues: uneven regulation, vulnerable athletes, and the constant temptation, for some, to trade integrity for short-term gain. Laws had tightened, commissions had learned from past mistakes, and the blatant monopolies and openly mob-backed stables of his era were gone. Yet echoes of the Carbo years remained, lessons about what can happen when a single, determined figure, operating in the gray zones between legality and illegality, is allowed to entwine his interests with the hopes and livelihoods of men who step into the ring, believing that only their own fists will determine their fate. Years after his death, his name still hung in the air of certain rooms like a smell that wouldn't quite go away. In cramped newspaper offices where veteran boxing writers traded stories, in law school seminars about organized crime, in the hearing rooms of Congress when the subject turned again to corruption in sport, someone would eventually lean back and say it. Carbo. Younger faces around the table, who knew the name only dimly, would look up. And the old hands would begin to explain how a man who had died in relative obscurity in a Miami Beach apartment in 1976 had once managed to bend an entire sport around his will. The first serious attempts to piece together his life in full came in the late 1970s and 1980s, when journalists and historians began to enjoy broader access to government records. Through Freedom of Information Act requests and the declassification of old files, the FBI and Justice Department's thick folders on mid-century organized crime slowly opened. Within them, among pages on better-known bosses and syndicate structures, lay memoranda and reports that tracked Frank Carbo from his first arrests through Murder, Inc. investigations, then on to Senate hearings and the Don Jordan case. The documents painted a more granular picture than the one preserved in news clippings and courtroom snapshots. They showed how often his name appeared in internal intelligence summaries when a certain kind of killing took place in New York in the 1930s, even if that trail rarely led to indictments. They spelled out, in bureaucratic prose, his suspected role as an enforcer for the Gagliano, Lucchi's family, and later, as a figure of major influence in professional boxing. They recorded agents' frustrations, the same pattern of whispers, the same lack of cooperative witnesses, the same man walking out of station houses on lesser charges while more serious accusations evaporated. At the same time, another body of retrospective material was taking shape in more public form. Books by former prosecutors like Burton Turcuse, who had helped dismantle Murder, Inc., and by crime reporters who had covered the Kefauver era, drew heavily on their recollections and on the files they had seen in their working years. They tended to emphasize the lurid tales of Brooklyn killers on call, of bosses picking up telephones in plush offices to order deaths in back alleys. In such accounts, Carbo often appeared as one member of a grim fraternity of hitmen and torpedoes, his later career in boxing treated almost as an afterthought. Sports writers and boxing historians, coming at the subject from a different angle, did the opposite. For them, Carbo was first and foremost the shadow behind the ring lights. They trawled through commission reports, promotional contracts, and the transcripts of Senate hearings on boxing. They interviewed surviving fighters and managers who had been active in the 1940s and 1950s. In their work, his early life as a street enforcer was context, but the heart of the story lay in his quiet domination of the talent pipeline that fed Madison Square Garden and Friday night television. Those two lines of research intersected uneasily. How much of the Murder, Inc. legend was precisely that, a legend built on the testimony of men under pressure to trade tailies for their lives? How much of the image of Carbo as boxing's czar reflected the reality of his reach, and how much came from senators and reporters searching for a single villain to embody a complex web of corruption. The archival record, when examined in detail, suggested a figure both smaller and more dangerous than the myths. On one hand, Carbo was never the head of a mafia family in the formal sense. He did not sit on the commission that Luciano and his peers established. In the hierarchy of New York's Italian underworld, he was an important but subordinate specialist, trusted to carry out violence when necessary, later trusted to manage certain lucrative sidelines like boxing, but always answerable to higher-ranking bosses. When Senate reports called him the undisputed underworld boss of boxing, they were capturing his centrality in that specific sphere, not conferring on him a general crown within organized crime. On the other hand, that specificity made his influence in the fight game unusually concentrated. Other racketeers dabbled in boxing or controlled a fighter here and there, alongside their interest in numbers, loan sharking, or jukebox routes. Carbo, particularly from the late 1940s through the 1950s, devoted most of his energy and organizational skill to the sport. He knew the managers, the trainers, the promoters who were indispensable to getting fights made. He understood the pressures on young boxers and the vulnerabilities of state commissions. He occupied, as one later historian put it, the narrow channel where the underworld and a single major sport most intensely overlapped. In the 1980s, the public's image of that overlap was powerfully shaped by cinema. Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull, based on Jake LaMotta's autobiography, reached a wide audience with its black and white depiction of the middleweight's brutal rise and fall. In one pivotal stretch, the film dramatizes LaMotta's decision to throw a fight to secure a title shot, a dramatization of the real-life Billy Fox bout LaMotta later admitted he had fixed. On screen, the figures leaning on him are unnamed mobsters, composite characters rather than one-to-one portraits. But viewers attuned to history could see, in their silhouettes, echoes of the men who had operated around LaMotta in reality, men whose network ultimately traced back to Carbo and Palermo. Another film, The Harder They Fall, had prefigured this treatment decades earlier. Released in 1956, the same year as Carbo's first Kefauver appearance, it told the story of a washed-up sportswriter who agrees to help build up a hopeless Argentinian heavyweight for a cynical championship run, only to recoil at the cruelty and deceit involved. The novel on which it was based, by Bud Schulberg, had been published in 1947, drawing on Schulberg's first-hand reporting from gyms and arenas during the very years Carbo was expanding his hold over the sport. Though neither book nor film named any real mobster, and their fictional promoters and handlers were stitched together from many sources, audiences and later critics saw in their corrupt machinery a reflection of the world Carbo dominated. These cultural artifacts, while fictional, did something that official reports rarely could. They conveyed the texture of the environment in which a figure like Carbo operated. The dingy gyms with peeling paint and bare bulbs, the locker rooms where managers counted out small stacks of bills in front of fighters too exhausted to scrutinize them, the back tables in midtown restaurants where men in dark suits discussed gate percentages and television rights. By the time audiences watched these scenes in the 1980s and 1990s on VHS tapes or cable, the real man behind much of that world had been dead for years. But his presence lingered in the genre of boxing noir he had helped inspire. In congressional chambers, his name served a more didactic purpose. When Senator John McCain and other members of the Senate Commerce Committee held hearings on boxing reform in the 1990s, they cast their work self-consciously against the backdrop of history. Witnesses, regulators, fighters, promoters were invited to describe not only contemporary abuses, but also the long pattern of mismanagement and exploitation in the sport. Side by side with complaints about modern sanctioning bodies and unscrupulous managers, the examples from the Carbo era were trotted out. The LaMotta fix, Ike Williams's lost earnings, the Don Jordan extortion. These references were not mere ornament. They helped frame legislative efforts like the Professional Boxing Safety Act of 1996 and the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act of 2000. The Safety Act sought primarily to address physical welfare, establishing minimum medical standards, mandating the presence of qualified physicians, and requiring state commissions to share information. The Ali Act went further, targeting the kind of economic and structural problems that had allowed Carbo to thrive. It required greater transparency in contracts and financial arrangements, attempted to separate promoters from managers to reduce conflicts of interest, and put in place disclosure rules for sanctioning bodies. In debate, senators explicitly invoked the mid-century period when, as one put it, mob-controlled managers and unregulated promoters treated fighters like property. They cited Carbo's web of hidden contract interests as a cautionary tale, proof that when regulators fail to insist on clear, public ownership of fighters' services, those services will be quietly divided up by the most aggressive and least scrupulous actors in the market. The Ali Act, whatever its limitations in practice, bore the imprint of that historical consciousness. It was, in part, an attempt to make sure that no one could again occupy the same position with the same impunity. Historians, less bound to the rhythms of legislative debate, asked a different set of questions. What had produced a figure like Carbo in the first place? To what extent was he an aberration? And to what extent the logical product of structural conditions? In boxing, in ethnic immigrant communities, in American capitalism more broadly. They noted that boxing had always been a sport of the margins. Since the bare-knuckle days of the 19th century, it had drawn its talent from the poor and its financing from gamblers. Respectable society had, until well into the 20th century, either shunned it as brutal or tolerated it warily. In that vacuum, informal managers and backers had always played an outsized role. For a boy like Francesco Carbo, born into a New York tenement at the turn of the century, the boxing world was less an alien realm than a near neighbor. The same pushcart streets and crowded hallways that produced young men willing to serve as lookouts or muscle for the early mafia also produced young men willing to fight for pay. The local gangs and the local gyms were often only a block apart. In some neighborhoods, they occupied the same space at different hours. When legitimate avenues of advancement were choked by prejudice and poverty, and when the law was experienced less as a protector than as an occasional menace, the line between crime and commerce blurred. In that sense, Carbo's path, street enforcer, then fixer in a semi-legitimate industry, reflected a broader pattern among second-generation immigrant communities in the first half of the 20th century. What made him unusual was not the direction of his movement, but the degree to which he mastered and monopolized his chosen niche. Others could have become the underworld's main conduit into mid-century boxing. Through a combination of temperament, opportunity, and luck, it was Carbo who did. That luck, as even some of his law enforcement adversaries later acknowledged, cut both ways. It allowed him to avoid death sentences in the Murder, Inc. era, to sidestep more serious convictions in the 1940s and 1950s, and to build a vast influence without ever holding a license or a public office in the sport. But it also fed a kind of overconfidence. When he and Palermo pressed Don Nesseth over Don Jordan's contract, they were working from a playbook that had served them for years. Apply pressure, hint at consequences, and expect acquiescence. What they did not fully appreciate was how the legal and cultural environment had shifted by 1960, making that same pattern prosecutable in ways it had not been before. The evolving assessment of Carbo's legacy also forced boxing to confront uncomfortable questions about its own complicity. Underworld influence, after all, did not operate in a vacuum. It depended on the willingness, even eagerness, of some promoters, managers, and arena owners to take mob money, to look the other way when intimidation kept troublesome fighters in line, and to accept that certain arrangements had to be made for business to proceed smoothly. Men like Jim Norris at the International Boxing Club never admitted to knowingly partnering with Carbo, and formal investigations failed to prove that they had explicit under-the-table deals. But the web of shared interests and mutual advantage between legitimate promoters and shadow backers was undeniable. In the decades after his fall, some in the boxing establishment tried to draw a sharp line between then and now, between a supposedly bad old era dominated by mobsters and a present cleansed by regulation and corporate oversight. Others, more candid, suggested the line was blurrier. The names had changed. The locus of power had shifted from smoky back rooms to boardrooms and television network offices, but the core dynamics of leverage, information asymmetry, and the exploitation of vulnerable athletes persisted in new forms. In that reading, Carbo's story was not an isolated morality tale, but one chapter in a longer narrative about how power moves through sport. Even within organized crime circles, his legend remained contested. Some veteran mob associates, interviewed anonymously in later years, downplayed his status, portraying him as an efficient operative who happened to find a particularly profitable sideline in boxing. They emphasized that ultimate authority over his activities lay with higher-ranking bosses in the Lucchese family, and by extension, the Mafia's National Commission. Others, including law enforcement agents who had spent careers tracking such people, insisted that within his domain, he exercised a degree of autonomy unusual even for a trusted soldier. It was he, they argued, who shaped the day-to-day mechanics of contract control and fight arrangements, not men in more exalted positions who might never have set foot in a gym. The tension between those views speaks to a broader truth about figures like Carbo. They operated in the interstices of formal and informal power structures, making it difficult to assign clear-cut labels like boss or underboss in the way one might in a corporate chart. His authority derived as much from his reputation, his perceived willingness to act, his history of not talking, as from any formal appointment. In the fragile world of boxing, where so much depended on handshake deals and tacit understandings, that kind of personal capital could matter more than the exact number of stripes on a mafia chart. By the early 21st century, when younger fans and even some younger fighters heard his name, it was often in the context of retrospectives or documentaries about boxing, dark past. Grainy black and white footage of him sitting stonily before Senate microphones alternated with shots of bloody title fights from the 1950s and 1960s. Narrators explained his role in measured tones, emphasizing the suffering of fighters caught in his web and the legal reforms spurred by his abuses. The man himself, once so feared that managers lowered their voices when mentioning him in gyms, had become a case study. There is an irony in that transformation. For most of his life, Frank Carbo had tried to remain off-stage, present in outcomes, invisible in public narratives. Fighters' names went up in lights, promoters balanced on the ropes waving to crowds, managers posed for photographs with their arms around champions' shoulders. He stayed in the wings, content to let others take the applause or the blame, as long as his share of the money and control flowed as it should. Only in the end, dragged into the bright wash of Senate television cameras and courtroom sketches, was he forced into the role of protagonist. In the years since, that role has hardened. To many, he stands less as a fully rounded human being, shaped by the cramped tenements of his youth, the violence of prohibition streets, the bewildering boom of television, than as a symbol, the embodiment of a particular conjunction of crime, sport, and media in mid-century America. Symbols are necessarily simplifications. They flatten complexities, underplay the ambiguities and half-truths that any honest historian must acknowledge. Yet symbols can also be instructive. In telling and retelling the story of Frank Carbo, the rise from obscure tough to unofficial commissioner of boxing, the years of quiet dominance, the final reckoning in a California courtroom, generations of writers, lawmakers, and fans have used his life as a way to think about deeper questions. Who gets to control a public entertainment? How do we protect young athletes from those who would turn their bodies into chips in larger games? When does a sport cease to be sport and become, instead, a staged performance for the benefit of unseen interests? The answers are never simple, and they change as laws, technologies, and cultures evolve. But the questions remain. In that sense, long after the last person who knew him in life has passed, and long after the last of the old smoky arenas has been converted into a convention center or demolished, Frank Carbo's shadow still falls, faint but discernible, across the ring. On a big fight night in the early 21st century, the scene could not look more different from the cramped, smoke-filled venues of Frank Carbo's peak years. Arenas glow with LED screens. Corporate logos wrap the ring apron. Television trucks hum outside, feeding high-definition pictures and instant replays to millions of homes around the world. Promoters in bright jackets work the cameras. Sanctioning body officials in blazers and lapel pins pose for photographs. There are still whispers about bad decisions and crooked managers, still arguments that certain fighters are protected. But the language in which these complaints are expressed has changed. Fans talk about television contracts, sanctioning fees and pay-per-view points, not the boys or the mob. Yet in the quiet zones behind the glare, in regulators' offices, in the conference rooms where ethics seminars for new commission members are held, in the footnotes of thick reports on sports integrity, Frank Carbo's name still appears. His story has become part of the professional memory of boxing, a cautionary thread running through discussions of how easily a sport can be captured when its basic structures are weak. Seen from this vantage point, decades after his death, that story looks less like a sequence of isolated episodes and more like a continuous arc running through the American 20th century. It begins in the immigrant tenements of New York at a time when the police were often viewed as foreign occupiers rather than protectors. It moves through Prohibition, when the federal government created overnight a vast illegal market in alcohol, and then seemed surprised when people like Carbo filled it. It passes into the Depression and war years, when young men fought for pay in rings and in streets, and when violence became bureaucratized in outfits like Murder, Inc. It rises into the neon of post-war television, where the same man who once carried a gun on Brooklyn corners learned to manipulate contracts and broadcast schedules. Finally, it breaks under the combined weight of antitrust law, federal extortion statutes, and changing public expectations about fairness in sport. That broader trajectory makes it difficult to treat Carbo simply as a monstrous individual, as some early tabloid coverage did, or as a romantic anti-hero, as certain nostalgic accounts have been tempted to do. He was neither a lone aberration nor a folk figure. He was, instead, a skilled navigator of conditions he did not create, a sport with weak internal controls and a ready connection to gambling, a justice system hamstrung for years by narrow statutes and fearful witnesses, and a society willing, for a long time, to look past the origins of its entertainments as long as the show went on. The harm that flowed from his particular use of those conditions is, however, clear. Fighters at the center of his web lost not only money but autonomy. When a young boxer signed a contract that secretly gave up half or more of his earnings to unseen partners, he was not merely being shortchanged. He was ceding control over where and when he would fight, over whether he would be matched too hard or too soft, and in some cases over whether he would be pressured to take part in bouts arranged to suit gamblers. The most dramatic instance of that, Jake LaMotta's thrown fight with Billy Fox, entered the historical record only because LaMotta chose, years later, to admit what he had done. Others likely went unconfessed. Even in contests that were not fixed in the narrow sense, Carbo's influence distorted competition. Championship opportunities flowed not simply to the most deserving contender, but to the one whose manager had accepted the right handshake in the right back room. Boxers who refused to sign over percentages found themselves fighting on the margins, shut out of the television dates that could have set them up for life. Over time, These patterns helped entrench a culture in which many fighters assumed that the official rules of rankings and eliminators were, at best, rough guidelines, always subject to override by invisible forces. The corrosive effect on public confidence was no less significant. Fans might not have known the names of the men behind the scenes, but they could sense when something was wrong. A string of dubious decisions in favor of certain fighters, a suspiciously lackluster performance by a usually aggressive contender, a champion defending against a string of challengers who all seemed to come from the same stable. Each of these chipped away at the belief that the better man usually won. When Senate hearings in the 1950s and 1960s confirmed what many had suspected, that belief took a deeper hit. At the same time, examining Carbo's life with historical distance requires acknowledging what the sources do not tell us. He left no memoir. He rarely spoke publicly, and when he did, it was to refuse answers, not to explain himself. Almost everything known about him comes from the words of others, prosecutors, FBI agents, cooperating witnesses seeking leniency, angry former associates, and exploited fighters. Each of those voices carries its own biases and blind spots. Murder, Inc. Turncoats had strong incentives to exaggerate others' roles and minimize their own. Politicians at televised hearings sometimes sharpened their rhetoric for the cameras. Retired boxers spoke through the fog of memory, pride, and regret. Historians working with such material proceed cautiously, cross-checking statements, looking for corroboration in independent documents, and nodding where the record remains murky. In Carbo's case, some of the most enduring popular images, the idea, for instance, that he personally ordered dozens of murders as a kind of underworld executive, are difficult to prove beyond doubt. His reputation as a gunman is well supported by early arrest records and the consistent way his name appears in internal police reports on gangland killings. But the exact number and nature of acts he personally committed remains uncertain. By contrast, his position in boxing is more concretely evidenced. Contracts, commission files, and the testimony of multiple fighters and managers, given years apart and in different forums, converge on the same basic picture. From the late 1940s through the 1950s, he and Blinky Palermo held substantial, undeclared financial interests in a cluster of top-ranked fighters across several weight divisions. They used those interests to influence matchmaking, control the flow of championship opportunities, and secure their own share of purses. The Don Jordan case, with its indictments, trial record, and conviction, provides the most detailed single example of those methods, but it was clearly not unique. Placing his story alongside other episodes of sports corruption worldwide also helps clarify what was distinctive about it. The 1919 Black Sox scandal, in which Chicago White Sox players conspired with gamblers to fix the World Series, was a dramatic one-off event that shocked baseball into adopting strict anti-gambling rules and creating the office of commissioner. Later basketball point-shaving scandals at American colleges or match-fixing schemes in European soccer have typically involved external gamblers targeting individual games or series. In most of these cases, the basic structure of the sport remained intact. The corruption attacked it from the outside. Carbo's influence worked differently. It operated not game by game, but through long-term control of labor. By owning pieces of fighters' futures at the contract level, and by tying those contracts into a network of complicit managers and promoters, he helped rewire boxing circuitry from within. The sport remained recognizably itself. Fighters still trained brutally, still climbed through the ropes, still got hurt in ways no gambler could fake. But the choices about who fought whom and on what terms were skewed by a set of interests invisible to the public. In that sense, his legacy speaks not only to the dangers of outright criminal intrusion into sport, but also to the vulnerabilities inherent in any system where the workers, the athletes, have limited power and limited access to independent advice. Boxers in Carbo's time signed complex agreements without lawyers, often without even being fully literate in English. They depended on managers to interpret documents and to negotiate on their behalf. When a manager's incentives aligned with those of an underworld backer rather than with those of the fighter, abuse was easy. The reforms that followed, both the tightening of licensing rules by state commissions and the Federal Ali Act's requirements for greater contractual transparency, were attempts to address that structural problem. They did not abolish exploitation in boxing. Stories of unfair contracts and rapacious promoters continued to surface. But they changed the legal landscape enough that someone trying to build Carbo's kind of quiet empire would face more obstacles. A fighter who suspected that his manager was sharing his purse with an unlicensed third party, for instance, would have at least some statutory basis on which to challenge the arrangement. Beyond law and regulation, Carbo's story has also influenced the ethical self-conception of certain corners of the boxing world. Trainers and managers who pride themselves on operating cleanly sometimes invoke those days as a dark mirror. They tell young fighters about how champions once died broke despite having fought for television networks and filled arenas, about how careers were shortened or derailed by matchups made to serve someone else's agenda. In these cautionary lectures, Carbo functions as a kind of negative patron saint, the figure whose example one must vow never to follow. It would be simplistic, though, to imagine that his fall and the passage of time have immunized boxing from similar dangers. As legal gambling on sports expands, as new forms of online wagering take root, concerns about match manipulation and undue influence resurface in fresh guises. The individuals involved may no longer have mafia nicknames or appear in FBI files. But the basic temptations, to profit from inside knowledge, to steer outcomes, to treat athletes as means to ends, persist. Remembering how thoroughly one determined man once penetrated an entire sport can serve as a useful reminder of how vigilant regulators, journalists, and fans must remain. On a more human level, Carbo's life invites reflection on the interplay between individual agency and structural constraint. He was born into genuine hardship, in a time and place where opportunities for someone of his background were sharply limited. He grew up amid violence and corruption not merely as abstractions, but as daily realities. His early choices, to run errands for local gangs, to carry weapons, to align himself with underworld figures, were shaped by that environment. It is possible and important to acknowledge those forces without accepting them as destiny. At every step, alternatives existed. Men from similar backgrounds chose other paths, grinding out lives as laborers, small businessmen, or, in some cases, honest participants in the same sports world Carbo corrupted. What distinguished him was not that the system gave him no chance, but that he proved particularly adept at exploiting its weaknesses once he decided where his loyalties lay. That choice had consequences for hundreds of fighters, and for millions of fans who thought they were watching unscripted drama. His refusal to speak frankly about his actions, to senators, to judges, or in any retrospective account, means that his internal justifications, if he had them, remain unknowable. Perhaps he saw himself as simply playing the game by the only rules that mattered to him: strength, cunning, and loyalty to his underworld superiors. Perhaps he, like some of his contemporaries, rationalized his hold over fighters as a kind of rough patronage. They got opportunities, he got paid. The silence he maintained makes it impossible to test such hypotheses against his own words. What does remain, unclouded by his perspective, are the institutional lessons his story bequeaths. Boxing, as a business and as a sport, emerged from the Carbo era with a sharper sense of its own fragility. It learned that leaving crucial economic relationships unwritten or hidden invites predation. It learned that assuming the market or the game will regulate itself is naive when powerful, unaccountable actors are at the table. And it learned that public trust, once damaged, is hard to regain. For the broader culture, his story became one of several threads in a larger tapestry of mid-century reckoning with organized crime. alongside accounts of union racketeering, casino skimming in Las Vegas, and political corruption in city halls. The tale of the quiet man who ran boxing from the shadows helped shift public attitudes. Where earlier generations had sometimes treated gangsters as colorful rogues, the cumulative effect of these revelations encouraged a more sober view, recognizing the systemic damage done when private criminal interests capture public institutions and pastimes. In the end, the arc of Frank Carbo's life traces a kind of inverted American dream. He rose from poverty to power, from anonymous streets to a position where United States senators summoned him by name. But the means by which he climbed, violence, intimidation, and the exploitation of others' talents, ensured that his influence would be both corrosive and ultimately unsustainable. His final years, spent in prison hospitals and anonymous rooms far from the cities whose nightlife he once helped shape, underscored the hollowness of that ascent. Today, when historians, regulators, or fans look back across the decades to make sense of how boxing became what it is, they find his fingerprints at key junctures. The sport's governance, its legal framework, even its self-image bear the marks of the struggle to free itself from men like him. Remembering that struggle in detail, its causes, its costs, and its incomplete victories, is one way to honor not the racketeers who tried to own the ring, but the fighters who stepped into it believing, then as now, that what happened between the ropes ought to be decided by courage, skill, and will, not by the calculations of unseen hands.